Good morning, everybody. It is August 15th, 2026. And on August 8th, Iran did something that told you more about the regime's desperation, its miscalculation, its internal dysfunction, and its strategic trajectory than any IRGC press release or diplomatic statement ever could. Iran launched a missile strike against an ADNOC tanker, a vessel owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which is the state oil company of the United Arab Emirates. While it was crossing the Strait of Hormuz, that was the 16th ship attack since this conflict began. The UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned it as a flagrant violation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2817. Qatar condemned it. The Gulf Cooperation Council Secretary General called it a dangerous and unacceptable escalation. And ADNOC confirmed that 15 of its vessels had been attacked by Iranian missiles and drones since the start of the conflict, killing one crew member and injuring 20 others. Read that sentence twice. 15 ADNOC vessels. Iran has been systematically attacking the commercial shipping assets of the United Arab Emirates, the wealthiest and most strategically significant Gulf Arab state, the country whose commercial infrastructure makes Dubai the trading hub of the Middle East, while simultaneously conducting diplomatic talks through Oman and claiming to be a constructive party to a ceasefire process. Every single one of those strikes tells you something specific and important about what Iran is, what it wants, what it fears, and why everything it is doing in the Strait is backfiring in ways its leadership apparently cannot see or refuses to acknowledge. Today, we are going to read every one of those strikes like a strategic intelligence assessment and pull out exactly what each one reveals. Here is what we are covering. We are going to walk through the full chronology of Iran's Strait of Hormuz strike campaign, the 16 vessel attacks, what they targeted, what they achieved, and what each targeting decision reveals about the IRGC's strategy, its capabilities, and its desperation. We are going to go deep on the ADNOC attack specifically, because attacking the UAE's state oil company is not a random or incidental target selection. It is a deliberate strategic message that reveals exactly what Iran is trying to accomplish and why that calculation is profoundly miscalculated. We are going to talk about the Mussafah II incident. The UAE-flagged tugboat struck in Omani territorial waters, killing 4 crew members, and why attacking ships inside Oman's maritime sovereignty while using Oman as your primary diplomatic backchannel reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the IRGC's operational authority versus the Iranian government's diplomatic strategy. We are going to cover the Shadow Fleet revenue picture, UAE's documentation of 66 tankers carrying Iranian oil since the June 17th MOU, generating an estimated $6 billion for the IRGC, and what those numbers reveal about who the Strait attacks are actually serving financially. We are going to do the shipping insurance and global economic analysis, and then we are going to do the strategic analysis that explains what every Iranian Strait strike, taken together as a body of evidence, tells us about where this conflict goes from here. Let us get into all of it. Start with the ADNOC strike, because it is the most recent, and because the specific target selection is the most revealing single decision Iran has made in this conflict. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is not an American company. It is not an Israeli company. It is not a British company or a French company. It is the state oil company of the United Arab Emirates, a Muslim-majority Gulf Arab country that shares Islam with the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has historically maintained complex but workable diplomatic and commercial relationships with Tehran, and that has no formal military alliance with the United States that would make it a clear legal military target under any theory of armed conflict. And yet, Iran has struck 15 of its vessels. The targeting rationale the IRGC has advanced is that the UAE has allowed American forces to use Emirati facilities, has provided intelligence support to the coalition, and has effectively participated in the anti-Iran campaign. There is truth in that assessment. The UAE has supported the U.S. military effort in ways that reflect its own strategic calculus about Iranian power. But the IRGC's decision to translate that support into direct commercial attacks on UAE state oil company vessels reveals several things simultaneously about Iranian strategic thinking. First, it reveals that the IRGC has calculated that attacking UAE economic assets will deter the UAE from deepening its military cooperation with the United States. The logic is, if hitting Emirati vessels creates enough economic pain for ADNOC and its government shareholders, the UAE will pressure Washington to stop the conflict or will reduce its own support for the campaign. That logic is the same logic behind every extortion scheme in history: create costs that exceed the value of the behavior you want to change. The problem is that the IRGC is applying extortion logic against a state that has its own strategic interests and its own assessment of what the post-conflict Middle East should look like. The UAE's leadership is not watching their vessels get hit and concluding that supporting the U.S. campaign was a mistake. They are watching their vessels get hit and concluding that the IRGC is an existential threat to Emirati commercial security that needs to be decisively defeated. The GCC Secretary General's language, dangerous and unacceptable escalation, is not the language of a mediator trying to calm things down. It is the language of a regional body moving toward endorsing stronger action. Iran's attempt to deter UAE participation is producing the opposite result. Second, the ADNOC targeting reveals something about where Iran's Strait of Hormuz leverage actually comes from and who it is actually threatening. Before this conflict, Iran's leverage in the Strait was based on the threat that it could restrict commercial shipping broadly enough to drive up global oil prices and create economic pain for importing countries – Europe, Japan, South Korea, China, India – severe enough to generate pressure on the United States to back down. That leverage depended on Iran's ability to threaten all shipping, not just the shipping of its specific enemies. The moment Iran starts targeting UAE vessels while claiming to provide safe passage for Iran-approved vessels, primarily Chinese-linked tankers carrying Iranian oil, it reveals that what the IRGC is actually running is not a maritime security operation, but a protection racket with a specific client list. You pay the Iranian toll, your ships pass. You are connected to the American coalition, your ships burn. That is not strait control. That is organized crime using maritime geography as its enforcement territory. And the international reaction to the ADNOC attack, UAE, Qatar, GCC, condemnation within hours, reflects the international recognition of exactly that reality. The full strike timeline across the conflict reveals the trajectory of Iran's maritime capabilities and strategy with brutal clarity. The Mussafah and its sister vessel were hit on June 25, 2026, 8 days after the MOU was signed, with a cruise missile in the Strait's southern lane. 1 crew member killed, 4 in serious or critical condition. These were 2 ships on the UN-designated safe route that was supposed to be protected under the MOU framework. The IRGC's decision to strike those specific vessels, ships following the exact route the MOU promised to protect, was not an accident or a miscommunication. It was the IRGC's military hardliners telling the world that no diplomatic agreement would constrain their operations in the Strait as long as the Strait represented their primary source of leverage and revenue. A Qatari-flagged LNG carrier was struck while transiting outbound with AIS turned off. The vessel had been running without its transponder for 19 days before it was hit. That targeting decision tells you something important and frequently overlooked about Iran's ISR capabilities. The IRGC can track AIS dark vessels. They are not relying solely on transponder data for their targeting picture. They have coastal surveillance assets, shore-based radar, surveillance boats, potentially satellite-derived data from commercial or other sources that allow them to maintain a picture of vessel movements in the Strait, even when those vessels have turned off the electronic systems that would normally make them easy to track. Iran hits AIS dark ships. That fact should have been front-page news for every maritime security analyst in the world. A Cyprus-flagged container ship was struck on what the IRGC characterized as an unauthorized route. The crew abandoned ship. 1 crew member was reported missing. A UAE-flagged tugboat, the Mussafah II, was struck in Omani territorial waters, killing 4 crew members. The Malta-flagged Safine Prestige was attacked in the Strait, abandoned by its crew. The Mussafah II attack in Omani territorial waters deserves specific analysis because of what it reveals about the fundamental contradiction between the IRGC's military operations and Iran's diplomatic strategy. Oman is Iran's most important diplomatic back channel. The Oman Channel is the primary mechanism through which U.S.-Iran negotiations have been conducted, from the secret pre-JCPOA talks through the current rounds of discussions about the enriched uranium and Strait access. Oman's role as a trusted intermediary depends entirely on Oman maintaining good relations with both sides and being seen as a neutral party whose territorial integrity is respected by all. When the IRGC strikes ships inside Omani territorial waters, killing 4 crew members, it is not just attacking a vessel. It is attacking the sanctity of the very geographic and diplomatic space through which its own government is conducting the negotiations that might end this conflict. The civilian government in Tehran needs Oman as a mediator. The IRGC generals operating in the Strait apparently do not care about the diplomatic asset the civilian government is trying to use. That disconnect, visible in a single targeting decision, tells you everything you need to know about how unified the Iranian regime actually is in this moment. The shadow generals running Strait operations are not coordinating with the diplomatic track. They are running their own strategy in the Strait, and the civilian government in Tehran is trying to negotiate its way out of a war while its own military keeps making new enemies and generating new pretexts for continued conflict. The diplomatic contradiction the Omani waters attack created deserves full treatment because it is the most concrete example in this entire conflict of the command fracture inside Iran operating in real time with visible consequences. The Oman-brokered talks that were proceeding in the same week as the Mussafah II attack were described by Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei as professional and progressing, with a joint statement on strait shipping coordinates in the final stage of review. Iranian diplomats are telling Omani counterparts that Iran wants a deal that opens the strait. Iranian military commanders operating inside the strait are hitting ships inside Omani territorial waters and killing Omani proximate crew members. These are not two elements of a coordinated strategy. They are two separate decision chains operating with no apparent coordination and in direct contradiction. The civilian government of Iran needs the Omani Channel to negotiate its way out of a war it is losing. The IRGC Navy commanders in the Strait do not answer to the civilian government in any meaningful operational sense. They answer to a chain of command that runs through the IRGC's own organizational structure, and that has financial interests in continued Strait operations that diplomatic resolution would eliminate. This is not a regime speaking with one voice. This is a fractured state where the military arm is actively undermining the diplomatic arm, because the military arm's interests and the diplomatic arm's interests are fundamentally incompatible. No deal that resolves the Strait question permanently serves the IRGC Navy's institutional interests. So the IRGC Navy keeps hitting ships, the diplomats keep negotiating, the two tracks proceed in opposite directions simultaneously. And the ships that get hit in the middle are the evidence that the Islamic Republic has a command dysfunction problem that no ceasefire agreement can resolve as long as the IRGC generals in the Strait retain operational authority independent of political direction from Tehran. The Shadow Fleet revenue picture adds a financial dimension to the Strait attack story that changes how you understand who these attacks are actually serving. UAE, United Against Nuclear Iran, has been tracking Iranian oil tanker movements throughout the conflict. And its August 4th shipping update documented 66 tankers departing the Gulf of Oman, laden with Iranian oil and petrochemicals, since the June 14th MOU announcement. Those 66 tankers carried approximately 80 million barrels of Iranian oil, generating an estimated revenue of over $6 billion for the IRGC. $6 billion of IRGC revenue during a ceasefire period, while the IRGC was simultaneously attacking commercial vessels that it was supposed to allow safe passage under the same ceasefire. The Chinese-linked and Iranian-linked vessels transiting the northern corridor of the Strait, the route Iran controls, are the financial beneficiaries of the IRGC's maritime extortion operation. Every ship that burns on the southern route is a ship that was not using the IRGC's preferred corridor. Every commercial vessel that reroutes from the southern lane to the northern corridor because the southern route is too dangerous is a vessel that is now flowing through the IRGC's toll zone. The attacks on the southern route and on UAE vessels are not random violence. They are a deliberate campaign to redirect commercial traffic toward the routes the IRGC controls and away from the UN-designated safe corridors that bypass IRGC toll collection. It is the maritime equivalent of a highway bandit destroying the competing road. The targeting of AIS dark vessels by the IRGC also tells you something important about the counter-surveillance measures the maritime community has been trying to use and why those measures have had limited effectiveness. The conventional maritime security assumption at the start of this conflict was that vessels could reduce their attack risk by turning off their AIS transponders, removing the electronic signal that would normally advertise their identity, position, and course to anyone with a receiver. This assumption was based on the model of past IRGC harassment operations, where the IRGC often used AIS data to identify specific vessels they wanted to target. If you are not broadcasting your identity, the theory went, you are harder to find and harder to positively identify as a target. The Qatari LNG carrier that was struck after 19 days of AIS off operation demolished that assumption definitively. 19 days of electronic silence did not protect the vessel. The IRGC tracked it anyway, using a combination of shore-based radar, surveillance boat visual reporting, drone overwatch, or potentially commercially available satellite tracking services that can follow vessels based on radar cross-section rather than transponder data. The fact that the IRGC can maintain tracking on AIS dark vessels changes the commercial shipping risk calculus in the Strait fundamentally. There is no electronic evasion measure available to a commercial vessel that the IRGC cannot work around with its remaining surveillance infrastructure. The protection available to commercial vessels in the Strait is not electronic. It is the physical presence of CENTCOM maritime assets and the deterrence provided by the knowledge that any IRGC vessel that attacks a commercial ship will itself face retaliation. Electronic silence is not safety. CENTCOM. Protection is safety. And that dependency on military protection rather than electronic evasion is itself a message about the permanent nature of the U.S. military presence requirement in the Strait that any long-term resolution of this conflict has to account for. The shipping insurance dimension tells you how deeply the Strait attacks have embedded themselves into global commercial risk calculations beyond any individual vessel strike. War risk insurance premiums for Persian Gulf transits have reached between 7, 5, and 10% of hull value per voyage. For a very large crude carrier, the VLCC class that is among the largest vessel types transiting the Strait, hull values typically range from $100 to $150 million. At 10% war risk premium, that is $10 to $15 million in additional insurance cost per voyage, on top of standard marine insurance. The cost gets passed through the shipping rate to the cargo buyer, which means every barrel of oil and every container of goods that transits the Strait is more expensive than it would be in the absence of Iranian maritime attacks. That cost falls on consumers in the importing countries, Japan, South Korea, India, European nations, who pay more for energy because the IRGC is running a protection racket in the world's most important energy shipping lane. And that cost persists even during periods of tactical quiet, because insurance markets price based on risk trajectory, not instantaneous conditions. The 16 attacks since the war began have permanently repriced the risk premium for Persian Gulf transits above where it was before February 28th, and reducing it back to pre-war levels requires not just a ceasefire, but a verified, sustained period of Iranian non-aggression that the IRGC's behavior throughout this conflict has not given the market any reason to expect in the near term. CENTCOM's response to the sustained Strait attack campaign reveals how the military has adapted its operational approach as the Iranian maritime threat has evolved throughout the conflict. After the Mombasa B attacks in late June, CENTCOM struck more than 60 IRGC small boats in and near the Strait to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking international commerce, specifically targeting the fast attack craft that provide the close-range harassment capability alongside the longer-range cruise missiles. CENTCOM also struck an Iranian military ground control station on Keshem Island in response to drone attacks on civilian mariners, and CENTCOM shot down 3 one-way attack drones launched by Iran towards civilian mariners in a documented defensive action that demonstrated the layered air and missile defense coverage that now extends over the commercial shipping lanes. The evolution from the opening weeks, where CENTCOM was primarily executing air campaigns against onshore military infrastructure, to this more direct maritime enforcement posture reflects the military's recognition that the Strait threat cannot be addressed solely by degrading onshore assets. The fast attack boats, the drone operators, and the small boat crews executing harassment attacks in the narrow geography of the Strait require a maritime response that is faster and more persistent than airstrikes alone can provide. Now, here's the honest assessment, because every strategic reading of Iran's Strait attacks requires one. Iran has sustained its maritime attack campaign despite 13 nights of the most intensive conventional bombing campaign in modern history against its military infrastructure, despite the destruction of more than 120 of its naval vessels, despite the elimination of its submarine arm, despite the systematic degradation of its coastal missile networks, despite the blockade, despite the killing of 40-plus senior commanders. 16 attacks through all of that. A military that was supposed to be combat ineffective per the Defense Secretary's declaration has continued finding ways to put cruise missiles and drones on commercial vessels in the world's most monitored waterway. That is not nothing. The IRGC's maritime harassment capability has been dramatically degraded from what it was on February 28th, but it has not been eliminated. The mobile, distributed nature of the fast attack craft threat and the residual cruise missile capability from coastal positions that survived the strikes means that any commercial vessel transiting the southern strait cannot consider itself fully safe. The attacks are less frequent, they are less coordinated, they are causing less catastrophic damage than a fully intact IRGC maritime network could cause, but they are still happening. And they will continue happening as long as there are IRGC units with weapons, and the authority to use them against ships the IRGC has designated as targets. There's one more dimension of the honest assessment that matters for understanding the Strait's trajectory, which is the international shipping industry's response to sustained Iranian attacks, and what that response means for the long-term commercial viability of the Strait as a global trade route. Reuters and Lloyd's List, the maritime industry's primary trade publication, have both reported significant and potentially permanent shifts in shipping route planning driven by the Iranian attack campaign. Container shipping lines that had already been diversifying their Hormuz exposure after the 2019 Abqaiq attack are now locking in Cape of Good Hope routing alternatives as their primary Hormuz bypass option for specific cargo categories. Longer sailing times and higher fuel costs for the Cape route are being calculated as preferable to war risk insurance premiums and the possibility of crew casualties on the Hormuz route. Some very large crude carriers have been rechartered specifically to avoid Hormuz transits, rerouting through the Bab al-Mandab and Red Sea, which introduced its own risks given Houthi activity, or around the Cape. These are not temporary adjustments that will reverse the moment a ceasefire is signed. They represent permanent changes to shipping logistics infrastructure. Routing calculations, crew contracts, insurance frameworks, cargo contracts that were built around the assumption that Hormuz was reliably open. Rebuilding confidence in Hormuz reliability as a commercial route requires not just a ceasefire, but a sustained, verified period of open strait operation, long enough for the insurance market to reprice, for the industry's risk models to update, and for the shipping companies that have invested in alternative routes to decide those alternatives are no longer necessary. The IRGC's 16 attacks have imposed a permanent commercial cost on Hormuz that extends years beyond the physical conflict, regardless of how the military and diplomatic situation resolves. What the 16 attacks collectively tell us about Iran's future trajectory is the part of the analysis that matters most beyond the immediate operational picture. Each attack tells you that the IRGC's military hardliners retain the operational authority and the will to continue maritime operations, regardless of what the civilian government in Tehran is negotiating. Each attack against UAE vessels tells you that the IRGC is willing to create new enemies in its immediate neighborhood. In exchange for tactical harassment leverage, it is losing on every other dimension. Each attack in Omani waters tells you that the IRGC is undermining its own government's diplomatic strategy in real time. Each AIS dark vessel targeting tells you that the IRGC maintains surveillance capabilities that are harder to degrade than its physical weapons. And the $6 billion shadow fleet revenue during the MOU period tells you that the financial incentives driving the Strait attacks are structural, not situational. The IRGC's business model depends on controlling the Strait's traffic, and no political agreement signed in Tehran or Muscat changes that as long as the IRGC generals who run the maritime operations believe their financial interests supersede the diplomatic commitments of the civilian government above them. The crew abandonment pattern across multiple vessel strikes also tells you something about the human cost that gets underreported in coverage that focuses on ships and missiles. When the Siphon Prestige was struck and the crew abandoned ship, those were real people. Filipino, Indian, Sri Lankan, and other Southeast Asian crew members who work on commercial vessels because it is the employment opportunity that pays well enough to support families back home. The maritime crew community is overwhelmingly composed of workers from developing countries who have nothing to do with geopolitical disputes between the United States and Iran, and who signed up to crew commercial vessels, not to risk their lives in a military conflict. ADNOC confirmed 1 crew member killed and 20 injured across 15 vessel attacks. The Mussafah 2 tugboat attack killed 4 crew members in Omani waters. These are the human beings on the receiving end of IRGC tactical decisions made by generals who will never stand on a tanker deck at 3 a.m. watching an incoming missile on radar. The International Maritime Organization's condemnation of the attacks, the insurance market's risk repricing, and the international legal proceedings being initiated under UNSCR 28-17 are all downstream consequences of the human cost that begins with sailors dying in the Strait because the IRGC decided a particular vessel was a target. That human cost is also a political cost that accumulates globally as every maritime nation, whose citizens crew commercial vessels in the Gulf, watches those citizens being killed and demands action from their governments. The coalition of political will against Iranian Strait attacks is broader than just the US-led military coalition because the crew casualty list represents a global cross-section of nationalities whose governments each have a domestic political reason to support enforcement of freedom of navigation. The free people of Iran who live in the port cities of Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and Chabahar, cities where ordinary Iranians work in the fishing industry, in commercial shipping support, in port services, are also watching the IRGC's maritime attack campaign create conditions that have destroyed the commercial viability of their own ports. Iranian commercial shipping has been blockaded. Iranian oil tankers cluster in anchorages along the coastline because they cannot export without risk of interception. The port services economy that ordinary Iranians in those cities depend on has been devastated. And the IRGC continues hitting foreign vessels in the Strait, which triggers more blockade enforcement, which extends the period during which Iranian commercial maritime activity is paralyzed. The same IRGC operation that is generating $6 billion in shadow fleet revenue for the IRGC's own accounts is destroying the legitimate maritime economy of the coastal Iranian cities where ordinary people live and work. The IRGC's Strait campaign is not protecting Iran. It is extracting revenue from Iran's geography while destroying the economic well-being of the Iranian people who live there. Here is the 40 chess strategic analysis. Iran's Strait of Hormuz strike campaign is simultaneously the most transparent and the most self-defeating element of the entire conflict. It is transparent because every attack is documented, every vessel is tracked, every targeting decision reveals something specific about IRGC capabilities, strategy, and internal command dynamics. And it is self-defeating because every attack accomplishes the opposite of what the IRGC's strategic framework predicts it should accomplish. Attacking UAE vessels was supposed to deter UAE participation. Instead, it is accelerating UAE military engagement and hardening Gulf Arab political positions against Iran. Attacking ships on the southern route was supposed to redirect traffic toward IRGC-controlled northern corridors. Instead, it is generating international calls for stronger enforcement of freedom of navigation, backed by a broader coalition. Attacking AIS dark vessels was supposed to demonstrate surveillance capability. Instead, it is creating demand for better commercial shipping protection measures that make future attacks harder. And continuing attacks through the MOU period was supposed to show that Iran could not be constrained. Instead, it provided the justification for resuming 13 nights of strikes that destroyed the infrastructure the maritime attack campaign depended on. The IRGC built a straight extortion operation over 30 years. Every strike it executes in the current environment is burning down what remains of that 30-year investment to fund a harassment campaign that is losing the war it was supposed to help win. The China dimension of the Strait attack campaign also deserves a final word before the closing question, because China's posture in response to the IRGC's vessel attacks is one of the clearest signals of how the international community's patience with Iran's maritime conduct has shifted. China has been buying Iranian oil at steep discounts throughout this conflict, and Chinese-linked tankers have been among the vessels transiting the northern corridor under Iranian-approved routing. But China has also been conspicuously quiet about condemning the IRGC's attacks on commercial shipping. Not because China approves of the attacks, but because China does not want to be seen publicly endorsing the enforcement mechanisms that CENTCOM is using to address them, which would legitimize American military presence in the Gulf. However, as ADNOC vessels accumulate hits and as Iranian attacks start reaching the northern corridor, shipping that primarily serves Chinese cargo interests, Beijing's calculus about the IRGC's maritime behavior is shifting from passive acceptance to active concern. The Strait of Hormuz, where the IRGC attacks shipping indiscriminately, is a strait that threatens the oil supply China depends on, not just the oil supply of American allies. Iran needs China's continued oil purchases to fund the IRGC. Iran cannot afford to extend its attack campaign to the point where Chinese-linked vessels start getting hit. That constraint is the one remaining external check on IRGC maritime operations that has not been exercised in this conflict. And whether it ever gets exercised depends on whether Beijing decides its economic interests in stable strait access have been sufficiently threatened by the IRGC's escalating campaign to warrant private pressure on Tehran. Every strait attack that gets closer to that threshold reveals something about how much Iran's IRGC is willing to risk the one relationship it cannot afford to lose. So what do you think? Does Iran's willingness to keep attacking Emirati and other Gulf Arab vessels, despite the military, diplomatic, and coalition costs of those attacks, represent a fundamental irrationality in IRGC decision-making? Or is there a strategic logic here that we are missing? Hand up with the Shadow Fleet generating $6 billion during the MOU ceasefire period? Does the financial incentive to maintain strait control mean the attacks will continue, regardless of what any diplomatic agreement says? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is the kind of forensic strategic analysis that tells you more about where this conflict is going than any press release from either side. Share this with someone who needs to understand what Iran's strait strikes actually reveal. Hit subscribe so you do not miss a single update as the situation continues to develop in real time. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next one.